Discuss with us topic 5.2 as well as topic 5.17. In this lecture video, I'm going to discuss ways in which we obtain wood, lumber, so that can be through methods such as clear cutting, selective cutting, and then I'm going to talk about more kind of sustainable forestry practices that we can do to ensure that we have more wood resources in the future. So looking at how are forests harvested, approximately about 73% of forests are used for commercial timber operations. And there are two very traditional practices that those types of companies can partake in, and that is clear cutting versus selective cutting. Clear cutting is pretty much as it sounds. A company that's going to harvest trees or wood are going to go in and they're going to remove pretty much almost all of the trees within a given area, while selective cutting harvests trees that are involved in the removal of single trees. So usually that's relatively small number of trees compared to clear cutting. Usually they choose maybe a certain aged tree, maybe a certain height of tree, rather than completely wiping out the area of all trees. So here you can see in the picture to the left, when you clear cut an area, right, completely remove, if not all the trees, what happens when you go to replant them is all of the trees wind up being the same age. In selective cutting, you can see you can get a much greater variety when you happen to have replanting and eventually regrowth. So that's usually going to be the better result for that ecosystem, because now with different aged trees, different heights of trees, that creates a little bit more variety, right, amongst the population, making them maybe more resilient or resistant to any disturbances that take place. Where we see this potentially an issue can be at tree plantations. This is areas where they plant the same tree species repeatedly, grow and harvest them year after year after year. Here they have less species diversity, which means much lower resilience, less habitat diversity for then other organisms as well. So actually, tree plantations are examples of what's known as a monoculture, only planting one type of plant and then harvesting it. Now, what are some of the impacts of clear cutting? Right? Like, why do companies even do this if it's going to be so bad for the environment? Well, clear cutting is an economically advantageous way to harvest wood. Because you can take it and take all of the wood all at once, there's no greater amounts of payments that have to be made there. It doesn't take quite as long as maybe selective cutting might. But although clear cutting can be economically advantageous, when wiping out all the vegetation, that can create soil erosion in the area, that can increase the soil and stream temperatures because now you are taking away an area of shade. It can also create a lot of flooding in the area. Right, and thinking back to like Unit 4, we know that a loss of that topsoil, that A horizon, right, we no longer have that stabilizing root structure there that's going to create for all of those soil particles to be carried to someplace else. And when that happens, that removes any organic matter and nutrients for that forest. In some cases, that sediment might even be deposited in local streams. Warmer waters and more cloudier waters makes it much harder for the organisms that reside in those streams in order to survive. And we know that we see that change in stream temperature because we see a loss of tree shade. That can also increase not only the water, but also the soil temperature too. And soil actually has lower albedo than our leaves of trees. And so that loss of tree shade, along with the rivers and streams, warms them collectively. Now, what about flooding, landslides? Well, a lot of the machinery used for logging purposes can unfortunately compact a lot of the soil. This can increase sunlight, dry out the soil. We once again see a loss of root structure, once again equals an erosion of topsoil and the O horizon as well. all of these factors, the compaction, the soil erosion, the increase in temperature, these all decrease that soil's water holding capabilities. So when there is maybe a tremendous large rain event or lots of precipitation all at once, this can actually create a landslide. So a complete destabilization of the root structure and soil structure in that area. Now, why care about forests in the first place? Well, this goes back to a topic we discussed back in Unit 2, where we mentioned ecosystem services, things that ecosystems can provide to us that some cases can be tangible and in others not. But why focus on forests to begin with? Well, we know forests have the ability to filter air pollutants. The leaves or pores of a tree or leaf can remove things like volatile organic compounds, VOCs, nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, PM. They can remove and store tremendous amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We know trees take in that CO2, store the carbon as a part of their biomass, and they release oxygen. And they provide habitats for other organisms, right? Many organisms tend to reside in a forest. It can also provide cultural services such as education and ecotourism. So that brings me to a practice FRQ. So take a moment, read the question here. I recommend writing your response in the Edpuzzle along with writing it in your note packet. Okay, here is our practice FRQ for 5.2. Describe one environmental consequence of clear-cutting a forest ecosystem. Here are some answers that you could have said. Clear-cutting a forest ecosystem can lead to the release of carbon dioxide that would have been stored in the biomass of trees. That excess CO2 leads to climate change. You might even see a greater occurrence of soil erosion, which leads to sediment pollution in nearby waterways. Or a lack of tree cover can prevent shade, causing soil or even water temperature to increase. All right, now on to topic 5.17. So now here we're going to discuss some sustainable forestry practices. Remember, when we talk about the word sustainable, right, we are trying to have a solution or a method to ensure that whatever resource we're using, we have enough for then future generations. So what are some sustainable forestry practices? So this would be an approach to still removing trees from the forest, but it's in ways in where we don't affect the viability of the tree species, right? Meaning their ability to continue to live on. Some sustainable forestry practices that you can do, as well as other much larger companies could do. You can recycle wood or maybe reuse it without recycling, right? Do an upcycle of furniture. Wood can be chipped and used as mulch for gardens or agricultural fields rather than wind up in a landfill. Reforestation, this is now replanting trees in an area that had recently been deforested, or selectively removing diseased trees to prevent the spread of infection through an entire forest. Now, another aspect to sustainable forestry is not only maybe reforesting, recycling wood, but it's also protecting our forests from a common occurrence known as forest fires. In many ecosystems, a forest fire is actually a natural process that should occur because when it does, it enables for the more recycling of nutrients. So it enables those nitrogen cycles, carbon cycles, phosphorus cycles to continue in that forest ecosystem. And so lots of humans have followed a number of fire management policies in order to ensure that ecosystems still can do a natural forest fire, but it not get out of hand. Now, one of those methods is known as a prescribed burn. This would be a fire that is deliberately set under very controlled conditions. This is to reduce any accumulation of biomass on the forest floor. So that could be sticks, that could be dried out leaf litter, that could be just dried out soil in general. But a prescribed burn is used to kind of wipe out all of that fuel that would be on the forest floor, because the more fuel on the forest floor, the greater chance there is for a much larger fire to take place and then rip through the actual canopy of the forest itself. All right, last practice FRQ for 5.17, identify one characteristic of forests that develop when fires are suppressed, and explain why the practice of fire suppression does not reduce but actually increases the risk of intense and extensive forest fires. Remember, make sure to write your answer in the Edpuzzle, and I recommend writing it in your notes as well. All right, so here are some accepted answers for this. So in the top box, this could have been anything that you identified, and then below that was the explanation that should have been tied to it. So if you happen to suppress forest fires, right, ensure that they don't happen naturally, that would create an accumulation of the combustible materials or the fuel for the fire. This could create larger trees to develop, even age stands develop, tree density happens to increase. But remember, whichever one of these choices you made should have been tied to the explanation below. So if you said something like accumulation of combustible materials, right, or a greater amount of debris on the forest floor, that adds to the fuel load or intensity of the fire. So that's the explanations that you see down below. All right, everyone, that is it for our video on 5.2 and 5.17. If you have any questions that you'd like me to continue going over in class, please leave it at the end of the video.